Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Paweł. I'm iOS Tech Lead here at Netguru, and today it will be my great pleasure to show you a few things about snapshot tests. So I think we'll begin with trying to figure out where those tests exactly fit in within the larger structure of tests we have. Then we'll see how they work, basically, how you can implement them in your own projects. We'll go through all the typical cases, known issues, and all the jazz. So without further ado, let's begin. Basically, for every kind of test, it's useful always to ask yourself whether, what this test actually does, what does it protect us against. We all know that the pyramid of tests, the automated tests. Basically, I'll go through each of those test types in a second. For now, I'll just like you to remember that basically the higher we go, the more expensive, the more time-consuming, the more awkward the tests become. At the same time, with dwindling coverage and greater and greater responsibility. So unit tests, we all love to write. They basically ensure that our code does what we as developers intend for it to do. They should have proper coverage. If not, Uncle Bob will most definitely dislike us. And obviously, they should also conform to something called FIRST, which is a set of principles. Namely, each test should be fast, independent, repeatable, self-validating, and timely. And as such, those tests only focus about just testing interactions and behaviors of the object. Moving on, we have integration tests. Those integration tests are also known as plumbing tests because their only purpose is to make sure that either a component or even entire system works properly, is properly configured. Obviously, they do not test any business rules, just making sure everything is assembled and configured properly. And finally, we have acceptance tests. Those are the only tests, by the way, that test business rules of our application, which means that they actually test what business people want the application to do. They should test as such the entire system, and because they are so insanely expensive to write and to maintain, they almost always focus on so-called happy path. By that I mean that they test only that the application is capable of providing features that are most important to the business, how the business makes money. So having all those tests, it begs us a question: where exactly those snapshot tests fit in, why they are needed, and what for? And the answer is quite simple, really. It turns out that all those tests have a small issue. They do not handle protecting against breaking of the UI, appearance of the UI of the application. Unit tests, for instance, obviously do not test the appearance as such, because it's very impractical. Just imagine you have a view with buttons, and you need to write tests to cover where the button is, how it looks like. And like a day later, the view gets redesigned, right? It's a nightmare. We don't do that most of the time. As for integration tests, they don't even touch the UI. Of course, if we have a very heavy branded application, we want to make sure that we take proper assets to build the application, then it's fine. But still, it's not testing the appearance of the UI, just which assets to take. And finally, acceptance tests, they touch the UI. However, they do it in a different way. In most of the acceptance tests, we do not want to test how certain views look like, but that their function is maintained. Namely, we want to know that the button is there, that we can click it, instead of finding out whether how it looks like or such. So it poses certain challenges. For instance, how do you want to protect yourself from breaking application UI appearance when you're changing the style sheet in the application? Same goes for different states of the views, especially those view states that are very rarely seen in the application. Same goes for reusable components that can have multiple states and configurations. translations, and so on and so forth. In general, the question is, how do we want to ensure that the application UI is not broken while we are about to press this big green button in GitHub, right? And here enter our snapshot tests. The way they work is actually very simple. We just take a view or core animation layer for all those hardcore Objective-C developers out there. We prepare it, we introduce a proper configuration, we make sure the view gets through all the lifecycle, and so on and so forth. And then we take a snapshot. And then we compare that snapshot with a reference that we already have in our repo. As a result, as you can see, we receive something called a reference image, difference image. And this difference image contains only the pixels that are different between those two compared images. And if the number of pixels on that difference image is greater than the set tolerance for a given test, then obviously the test fails. Fortunately, we don't have to do it ourselves. There are more than a few solutions out there that you can use to handle that for you. The first one, probably the most widespread, for a very long time, the only choice to implement that kind of test with ease is iOS snapshot test case, written Objective-C days, and it's, I would say, newer, more powerful sibling written in Swift, snapshot testing. So if you want to go old school, basically you have two options, either to subclass FB snapshot test case class to basically allow that specific test case to handle preparation of the view for snapshots, or you can just use methods to extract a snapshot and compare it and prepare the view yourself. For instance, it might be useful in BDD tests, like, for instance, using Quick Framework. Whichever you go, the first thing you need to do is to basically point out the reference folder in your schema. Unfortunately, it has to be done. It's a bit of a nuisance, I know, in modern days, but still, it's one-time job, so no problem there. And then if you want to use subclass this specific test case class provided by FB snapshot test case, then basically all you need to do is to prepare your view, provide the proper configuration, and the library basically takes care of preparing the view, making sure it goes through all the life cycle and so on and so forth. It's rated properly. Of course, you can set up tolerance. There is a recording mode, but alas, there's this subclass you have to do. So for some people, I know it might be a bit off-putting. So for those, we have the inlining option, also allowing to test view and view controllers. You don't have to basically subclass any special test case class. We can set up tolerance, however, we need to prepare the view ourselves, which might be a bit challenging. And there's unfortunately only the manual recording mode. So in this case, the example from Quick Framework and BD tests, you have to basically replace one matcher with the other to make a snapshot and then to compare it, which if you have hundreds of them in your suite, it's a bit of a nuisance, honestly. So if you want to go this way, I would suggest preparing certain helpers to ease the way out. Least of all, make sure the view has proper bounds and is properly laid out, and make sure the library has a proper reference to the snapshot reference folder. And then if you're preparing a view for snapshotting, it's useful to wrap it around certain protocols, like the one here, the view controller and views implement. And sometimes, regardless of the option you choose or the library you choose, it's necessary to add view to a window during tests to make sure it renders properly. I will speak on that subject in a minute. If you don't want to go old school, there's always a newer option. Fortunately, you don't have to subclass anything in using snapshot testing library. It's only inlining, so basically either just classic XC tests or nimble matchers for BDD / quick type tests. It's up to you, really a matter of preference. In here, as I said, we also can test everything which the previous library allowed us to test, but we don't have to, extend any custom test case classes. We also have global and local recording mode. You can also set tolerance, and a killer feature, basically, we can also simulate how our view would look like on different devices and screen orientation. And on top of that, if for some reason we want more detailed description of the view we are testing than just an image, we can create kind of a representation or a snapshot of its view hierarchy and then use it for comparison. So let's see how it looks like. So let's say I want to test my view on the some smaller phones like iPhone SE, and yeah, this is how it looks like. So how about a bigger phone like iPhone X? And yeah, we can do that as well. How about we rotated the screen to see the landscape mode? And yes, we can do that as well. We can set the tolerance, and finally, what I just mentioned, we can generate this description of the view hierarchy to have it compared between tests. But the last bit, got me thinking, why should we even limit ourselves to just snapshotting views? How about other structures, objects? Why not? How about a request? And yes, we can do that. What about maybe a kind of a structure, like codable? And yes, we can do that as well. But honestly, Suite has this delightful mirroring capability that allows us to get a description of basically almost any kind of object. So why not use it here? Maybe we can do that. And yes, we can. So all in all, pretty powerful stuff. Okay, moving on. Let's go through the typical cases you can encounter if you decide to implement those tests in your projects. Upwards of 90% would be simple view controllers. We can safely assume they take up almost entire screen. Of course, we have to make sure they are settled before we actually make a snapshot, so go through all the life cycle and so on and so forth. Often, if they have dynamic data providers, then stubbing and mocking will be required, obviously. And sometimes, as in all the cases I'm going to go through, we may need to add the tested object to a window to make sure it renders properly. As for quick examples, we've got like a very simple, very I would say a straightforward single purpose view. I'll just tend to snapshot them as they are. I do not fake or mock anything in them. In the contrary to the example on the right, it's a highly dynamic view. And obviously I had to fake all the data presented within. And this delightful gray rectangle at the top, it's where the Google Maps were supposed to be, but because it's highly volatile and unstable component, I simply mocked it so that it won't interfere with my snapshots. Then we have collections. Obviously, they take more than our screen can provide. So obviously, we have to adjust the snapshot size to make sure we capture all the content we want to show. Similarly to the previous example, this time we may be forced to add this collection to a window to make sure it renders okay. Of course, we need to wait till it's rendered, and it's very useful to snapshot all the collection can show, all the cells, all the headers, footers, whatnot, basically all the sections, you name it. And last least of all, Of course, you need to use fixture data, but it's useful to have it approximate real data as closely as possible. And just a quick set of examples. It's a collection or table view. Table view basically presenting different kinds of cells, sections, and so on, depending on the data is being provided. And if you can basically capture all those snapshots, then quite easily you can, do the refactoring to the cells or some changes without, fearing that something would break up in the UI. Similar here, different types of table view cells, different types of table view cell decorators, and so on and so forth. And lastly, a very simple example, quick search view presenting recent searches and some current searches. Basically, also having it snapshotted, we can safely go and refactor that component without fear that something will break up in one of those states. Moving on, arguably the types of views that take out most if you implement snapshot tests on them are reusable views. Obviously, often much smaller than the screen bounds. Obviously, as in previous example, capture all the states, use best approximation of real data you can find. But sometimes it's also useful to kind of push it to the limit. Use text that is obviously too long, use image that is too wide, just to see how your view reacts if user attempts such a thing in the application. And often or not, again, sometimes you have to add it to your window. So, given the very quick example, I would say the most common one is something called, which I used to call universal text input, which is basically a kind of a text field with a text input with the error correction capable of handling multiple input types like email, password, phone number, and so on and so forth. And in such a case, for instance, in here we have email. Right now the field is empty. This is how it looks when we enter valid email. This is how it looks with invalid email, and this is how it looks when users typing. But the same component can be used to actually input a password, a different kind of input altogether. And we should mirror or cover all those states for that kind of input as well. But then we can disable secure text entry, and then it looks very different. So basically, having snapshotted all those different states give us security that if you ever want to touch this module, obviously the UI will never break. And finally, the most difficult case to cover are animated views. Obviously, we need to test the states the view can be in, not the transitions between them. And in order to do that, in most cases, you have to kind of take control of the animations. And to do that, you need to fake factories or animation providers that you use in your code. Just giving you a quick example, because we don't have the time to even touch all the possible animation types we have in iOS. So I would say that upwards of 90% of the cases of the animations you have in your project would be simple UI kit type animations, like a UI view animate with. So the approach I would suggest is to create a wrapper that would simply mirror the very definition of those animation methods, like here, animate with duration, animation, and completion. Then make sure you extend the UI view so it would conform to your custom wrapper. Then inject the wrapper into the view you want to test, and then make sure that it's the wrapper that's actually performing the animations. Doing that, if you're actually inside your tests, you can make a fake or mock that also conforms to that protocol and then inject it into your view. If you do that, you can, in this fake, you can basically make the changes instantaneous. And therefore, you take control over how animations are executed because you disable them. And then you can safely make snapshots because the state of the view will be settled by then. Pretty useful trick. It applies not only to animation, but to many, many other things like that in tests. So yeah, moving on. Known issues. Unfortunately, there are more than a few. iOS updates for one. As we all know, Apple likes to update, and with almost every major update, we have slight changes to the UI, and often it turns out that after such an update, our snapshots, reference snapshots, are no longer valid, so we have to recreate them. But fortunately, we have this global recording mode that can do it for us with just a single line of code. Then, obviously, those tests take significantly longer to execute. Just giving you a quick example from the project using BDD types of tests and Quick Framework, we have roughly almost 4,000 individual test assertions, which their execution amount to total of almost 2 minutes, which is roughly 30 milliseconds per assertion. However, if we add 175 tests, snapshot tests into the mix, it suddenly adds 30 seconds. So it's almost 10 times more than standard test assertion. Of course, those numbers could be different for your machine and different if you use different testing framework, but still it's something just to keep in mind that maybe some views don't need that kind of tests, and just multiplying those snapshots is not generally a very good idea. Moving on, dynamic content, as we've just seen, the hardest thing to tackle using those tests, and unless you have a very good idea, I wouldn't recommend doing those tests there, unless, of course, you can assume control over those animations, turn them off, or disable them in a way that it would guarantee that the tests won't be flaky, basically. And of course, obviously, perform the snapshots when the view is settled. Finally, when it comes to tackling different devices and screen sizes, in the old days, we unfortunately had to relaunch the entire suite, basically, to test it on different simulator. But with the grace we have from the snapshot testing library, we can just define our quote-unquote device to see how our view would look like there. However, it's not something I would generally recommend. First of all, because it's just only a simulation, and the way the view looks like on the actual device may be a bit different, not too much, but still. And finally, in most cases, all you need to do is to manually set the size of your snapshot, and it will be enough. Summing up, I personally, using those tests for almost 4 years, I can say firmly that it gives an awesome sense of security and assurance when we are about to perform a refactor update to different reusable views, application style sheets, certain collections, especially with atypical data. We can cover all the possible states that you can be in, especially the states that are very rarely seen in the application. Those tests, as you were able to see, are very quick to set up. Arguably, they are also the easiest way to add at least a modicum of test coverage to the project that are not tested at all. And what's also important, you can add a great amount of context to your pull requests, adding snapshots of your views to your PR. It's really great help for reviewers to see how the view actually looks like, especially if you're doing views with XIBs or storyboards. And finally, whenever needed, there's this option to simulate how the view will look like on different devices and different screen size. As for negatives, Of course, they execute longer. They require maintenance. Also, there is this requirement to stick with a single simulator on your local device and in your CI. And then, obviously, as we explained, not very good for dynamic content. So, all in all, there are great ways to at least, get some measure of control over the application UI at a slight cost of time and money. But even if your client, has to wait a bit longer for the application, or maybe pay a bit more, it is a sacrifice I am more than willing to make. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Paweł, for your presentation. So far, I don't see any questions on chat. However, there is one quite curious Sebastian, who is asking about how would you like to translate snapshot test to Polish? Maybe do you know a proper translation?
In Polish?
Yeah.
Okay, it's a really tough one. Testy obrazkowe, perhaps, but
yeah, I think
honestly, it's a well-established joke within our community that at some point, most time you spend actually developing is finding proper names. That's usually in English, but it's for class, not for tests. But yeah, it kind of proves true. Okay,
so maybe we'll stick with English. And we would like to not translate it to Polish because it would sound very awkward.
Yeah.
So one more time, thank you for your presentation. And I think I will be able to take over your screen and start my presentation.
Again, thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon.